Today we're going to be talking about natural selection. The title for this section can just be natural selection. You may have heard of evolution or Charles Darwin or survival of the fittest. All of those things are some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. So our learning target today, I can use VIST, V-I-S-T. We'll talk about what that is. It's just an abbreviation to describe the theory of natural selection. Okay, so you don't have to write this down. I'm going to give you some background. I'm going to tell you a little story about what stuff was going on when they were talking about evolution. So back in the 1700s and 1800s, scientists began discovering fossils. And they noticed that these fossils didn't look like the organisms that existed today. So for example, if you find, this dinosaur skull, you would say, oh, this doesn't look like the skull of any animal we have on Earth today. So they started wondering why. Now, keep in mind, scientists didn't know that things went extinct. They didn't know that things changed over time. They were just beginning to scratch the surface here, okay? So we're going to skip that other scientist. We're going to go to Charles Darwin, okay? You can go ahead and write down Charles Darwin's name here. You do not need to know when he lived. I just put the dates on there so you get a general idea, right? He lived in the 1800s, but I would never ask you on a test or a quiz, when did Charles Darwin live? Because that's not important, all right? We need to know what he did and what he was famous for, not when he lived. So Charles Darwin was a naturalist, meaning he studied the natural world. So he's kind of a biologist. And he decided he was going to go study lots of different life forms all around the planet. Now, people in those days did not have private jets or, anything to fly them really quickly anywhere. So the fastest way and the easiest way was by ship. So this is kind of a picture of the ship that he took, and he decided he was going to go on this expedition. Now, the ships in that time did not go very fast, so it took him a very long time. We're talking months and months. Here's his whole path, okay? You don't have to write this down, but Darwin traveled around the world and he studied all the living organisms in all different places. So he started up here in England, okay, and he traveled all the way around South America, and then he came back over by Australia and Africa and back up. One of the places he stopped at were the Galapagos Islands, and these are off the coast of South America, kind of over by Peru and Ecuador and just south of Mexico here. So you'll notice there's a lot of small islands here that make up the Galapagos Islands. What Darwin looked at there, he looked at a lot of different plants and animals, and one thing he looked at were finches. So take a second, write down, how are these finches, these birds, how are they similar? Now what I want you to do is take a look at the birds and tell me how they're different. What makes them different? So what Darwin did is he looked at these birds and he saw that they were similar and they were different, okay? And the reason, after he watched them, that they were different is he saw that they ate different foods. So this guy ate seeds, and his beak was suited to crack open those seeds. This guy was a cactus finch, so he had a skinnier beak that could get into the cactus flowers. This one ate buds, and then this one was a woodpecker finch that ate insects. So lots of different types of finches, but they all kind of looked similar. So here's what we're going to write down. So from all of his studies, Darwin developed something called the theory of natural selection. He came up with this theory. It took him years to come up with it. So write this down. This idea of natural selection is that organisms that are best adapted to their environment survive and reproduce, passing on their genes. We'll explain what this means in a second. He published a book with this theory in it. And there were actually a couple other scientists who came up with a similar theory during his time as well. This is the theory we use to explain how organisms change over time today and why they change. Let me give you an example, okay? Let's say we've got two different types of mice, dark mice and light mice, okay? There's a bird and the bird eats mice. Well, which mice is the bird gonna eat? He's gonna eat the ones that are really easily seen, the ones that don't really camouflage into the background. So he's gonna eat all the white mice, okay? Over time, there's gonna be fewer white mice. There's gonna be more gray mice, and these gray mice are gonna be able to survive longer. So they're gonna reproduce and they're gonna make more gray mice babies. So over time, we're gonna get more gray mice because the gray mice are better adapted to their environment. They're better able to survive in this environment than the white mice. Now the key here is that organisms, they're not just, oh, this is the fittest of all, okay? Some people might say, oh, you know, a grizzly bear is the fittest of all. Well, if we put a grizzly bear in the desert, he's not really gonna survive, okay? He's not really the fittest there. So it all depends on the environment. If this environment were different and it was a white background, well, then probably the white mouse would be considered the fittest, right? Best able to survive and reproduce. So what are these requirements for natural selection? How does natural selection happen and what do we need for it to happen? Write this down. First of all, we need variation. Variation means that the organisms are different, okay? So the mice here are different. If the mice were all gray, and they were all exact clones of each other, none of them would be better at surviving than any of the other ones. So individuals have to have different traits. Luckily for us, all individuals, all organisms are different. So this is really not a problem. The second requirement is inheritance, okay? The parents have to be able to pass the traits to the offspring, meaning the traits have to be in their DNA. It can't just be something that they learn over time or that happens to them. It has to be something in their DNA. I'll give you an example of this in a second. So let me give you an example, okay? Traits must be inherited. So let's say, for example, you learn how to speak Spanish. You have kids. Are your kids gonna speak Spanish when they're born? Probably not, okay? Speaking Spanish is not in their DNA. Now your kids might learn to speak Spanish because they hear you speaking Spanish growing up, but they're gonna have to learn that, okay? So fur color is an example of something that would be in their DNA, right? Speaking Spanish is not. All right, the next one we have here is selection, okay? The environment selects which organisms are gonna survive. Now, we're not talking about, oh, the environment is an actual person and it's picking and choosing. We're just saying some individuals are better able to survive and reproduce. So in this case, right, the environment selects the gray mice to survive, okay, because they are the ones that are best able to survive and reproduce. And then time. So over time, the population will change. Populations are always changing, okay? So in this example, over time, we're gonna have more gray mice. So notice, This spells out VIST. So when we talk about that learning target of VIST, V-I-S-T, okay, this is what we're talking about. It's just the abbreviation. V for variation, I for inheritance, S for selection, and T for time. All right, one last thing to write down. What's evolution then? Evolution, or to evolve, just means changing over time, okay? Scientists figured out that organisms changed over, or that populations changed over time, okay? Because they knew that, well, there were some organisms that used to exist that no longer exist, but they still look similar. So what Darwin was talking about is those finches that he looked at probably all came from one original ancestor finch, okay? They probably all look the same, and then over time, the different finch populations changed and evolved to have different beaks and different shapes so that they were best suited to their environment. So the idea here is that scientists knew that things change, organisms and populations change over time. Natural selection, what Darwin came up with, he described how they evolve, okay? He said, oh, well, they change because some of them are better suited to surviving than others, okay? In this case, oh, look, the short giraffes, they can't reach the food. So over time, they're gonna die, right? And over time, the longer giraffes are gonna survive and reproduce. So over time, our population's going to evolve, so we have giraffes with longer necks. So individuals do not evolve, populations evolve, okay? This giraffe doesn't magically grow a long neck because he can't reach the leaves, okay? You do not magically grow longer arms because you need them to play basketball. Over time, what happens is though a population, a group of organisms does evolve, right? So in this first picture, we've got some short and some tall. Whereas in the second picture, over time, we only really have tall ones. So the idea is these groups evolve, but individuals don't evolve. So we're going to take a look at a worksheet that we're going to be doing here. So here's the worksheet we're going to be working on. All you have to do is read the scenario and then identify the 4 different parts of Darwin's theory of natural selection down here. So we'll do one together. It says there are 2 types of worms, worms that eat at night, nocturnal, and worms that eat during the day, diurnal. The birds eat during the day and seem to be eating only the diurnal worms. The nocturnal worms are in their burrows during this time. Each spring when the worms reproduce, they have about 500 babies, but only 100 of these 500 ever become old enough to reproduce. So the first thing we have to do is identify population has variation. Okay, so what is the variation? How are my worms different? Well, we've got nocturnal worms and diurnal worms, right? Worms that eat during the night and worms that eat during the day. Are the variations inherited? So for this, on all of them, you're gonna say yes for all of them on this worksheet, okay? Remember we talked about the fact that like speaking Spanish is not inherited, or if I spray paint my hair, that's not going to be inherited, okay? That's not gonna be passed down to my kids. So over time, which worms are going to survive? Right? It says the birds eat during the day and eat only the diurnal worms. So which ones will survive? The nocturnal worms, right? Over time, the population will change so that there are more blank and less blank worms. So over time, we would expect there'd be more nocturnal worms because they're surviving and fewer of the daytime diurnal worms. It's that simple. You just got to do the rest of the examples here and then you're done.